How could we understand Zacchaeus? To be a tax collector, he's colluding with the Roman Empire. This is an ethical and moral violation, and then he's stealing extra on top of that. Sometimes that helps us understand the scripture better if we can come up with modern analogies. So, can you think of anybody today who reminds you of Zacchaeus? Maybe don't call it out, it might put us in a bad mood. But you probably have a discouraging and infuriating number of options to choose from. Like, when I think about it, I get a swirl of Congress people and a collection of tech bros, religious influencers, consumerist commercial influencers. We really have a devastating array to choose from. So do any of the people that can come to your mind resemble Zacchaeus in his one endearing quality, his sincere desire to see Jesus? That part of Zacchaeus' story did not stand out to me when I was singing from childhood on Zacchaeus was a wee little man. I really hadn't noticed that endearing quality in Zacchaeus, but he knows what Jesus preaches about wealth and hoarding and stealing and greed. Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first. He says that it's more possible for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven. And when the young rich man says, "How can I follow you?" Jesus says, "You have to give away everything you have to follow me." So Zacchaeus, who longs so sincerely to see Jesus that he climbs up in the sycamore tree, knows what Jesus would have to say about his vocation and his choices, and he knows the harm that he's done to his neighbors. The people who are also crowding along this roadside to see Jesus, they see Zacchaeus climb up in the tree. And do you imagine they taunt him, pity him, laugh at him? Even in the story that he's so short he has to climb up, is poking fun at him. But Zacchaeus sincerely wants to see Jesus. And I might not have noticed that part of his character if it wasn't for the cat who climbed into our family back in March. I pet sit a lot for friends of ours who live in the woods, and they always have a pair of Malamutes or Huskies, because if they don't, the rodents around them start to encroach on their home. And so they've learned if they can keep a pair of these independent, brave dogs around, that really does minimize the rodent population, or at least provides a buffer between their house and the rodents. And over the years I have been pet sitting for them, I have lost count of how many dead animals I have picked up with a shovel, never with my bare hands, in a mixture of like disgust and fascination. For example, I had never seen minks in real life until I picked up dead ones on their front porch. The dogs don't ever try to eat these animals, they just bring them to the front porch. And I am pretty sure they are saying, "Look, I did my job." It's always extra sad to me when it's a cat that I have to pick up, because I love cats, and I will note that if the people around North Manchester would just do their part to spay and neuter cats, there would not be such an excess number roaming the countryside that they would desperately wander into these dogs' territory. So, one night in March, I showed up, it was after dark, and the dogs didn't want to go into their kennel. So I went inside and did the indoor chores, came back out. The dogs still would not go into their kennel, not even for their fake bacon treat. And I was tired and it was late, and you don't really have to put the dogs away. They can roam all night, they roam all day. They respect their electric invisible fence very successfully. So I just went home. And then when I came back the next night, again, late after dark, all of a sudden, I put some information together. The dogs were in the exact same place they'd been the night before. Their food dish 100 feet away was untouched. And where they were was at the base of a tree. So I nervously turned on the flashlight on my phone and shone it up into the tree, and there was a cat in that tree. And the dogs were so excited because they were doing their job, and here I was to witness it. So they were jumping all over me and vocalizing the way huskies do. And I dragged them one at a time, because they're too strong for me to drag them both. Dragged them one at a time, forced them to stay in their kennel, went and found a chair, climbed up on the chair, and reached up into the tree. And this cat came down and let me take him. So I held him, thinking he would want to run away from me. We'd never met before, right? I stuck him in my car, and I was just so heartbroken, thinking how thirsty and hungry and scared he must have been for at least 24 hours. Drove him home the 4 miles to our house, which he spent licking my face. He does continue to be an affectionate cat, but I'll point out, I don't think he's ever licked my face since then, so it must have been some real, desperate, grateful affection there to be licking my face. So I was very excited to show Philip, my husband, our new family member, and we did try, very half-heartedly to find a home, to see if he had already had a home. But since he was already, the vet thought, about 2 and had not yet been neutered, we kind of thought he was fair game for us to keep forever. Because that is what happens to cats in the country who are male and not neutered. They are going to roam. So my dad is the one that suggested we call him Zacchaeus, and we do. He is so appropriately a Zacchaeus because he is the one who has demonstrated for me this endearing part of Zacchaeus from Luke's character. Because we also have a dog. Some of you have met our dog. He is even bigger than those huskies. He's 165 pounds. His head alone is truly as big as this whole cat. I very seriously want to show you pictures after this worship service of our dog. And I want to show you pictures of Zacchaeus the cat cuddling with our dog. It started when we would be walking Cairo as our dog. We'd be walking him, and Zacchaeus wanted to come along because he's just truly the most social creature. He thinks every human, cat, and dog wants to be his friend, or at least he's going to try. And he would come along in the walk, and then he would start playing with the leash, and then it evolved into cuddling, which is just really bizarre. And to Cairo's credit, that he lays as still as possible for as long as possible, and then he buries his whole face in Zacchaeus' butt. And yeah, it doesn't usually last a lot longer after that. Zacchaeus has met other dogs too, including this fall, we had a friend who also has a husky. She came up and she was dog sitting for us while we were on vacation, and she said, "I don't think my dog is cat safe." So we forced all of our indoor-outdoor cats to be only outdoor cats. And guess who kept coming in the house? Zacchaeus kept coming in the house, just convinced that he and Abby, the husky, could be friends. This is what woke me up to the same beautiful, inspiring aspect of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. He so sincerely wants to see Jesus, so sincerely wants that relationship or that witness, that connection, that he will submit to the ridicule and scorn of his neighbors. He must know Jesus is going to tell him he has to overhaul his whole life, and he is willing to submit to Jesus. He's willing to submit to poverty, to die to himself for Jesus. So a friend of mine who's also in the Church of the Brethren and calls himself conservative, we like to talk about the differences between us and our theology. We like to talk about the state of the church and if there's any way to keep us together. He said recently that he thinks one big difference between progressive Christians and conservative Christians is that progressives say, what I'm supposed to do with my life is live as fully as I can into the person God created me to be. I am pretty sure I've said that at some point or something like that. Anybody else? Do you feel like that resonates with who you understand or how you understand your life? He says conservative Christians believe that they need to die to themselves so they can be reformed into the person God would have them be. Maybe you also relate to that. So, do you think this is an accurate assessment of progressive and conservative Christians? Yes, no, maybe. It's worth chewing on. And I haven't given you much time to chew on it. Here's what I said to my friend. That might be what people say, but I don't think it's accurate because I don't know conservative Christians who die to themselves and really let themselves be remade. I'm sure they exist, but I couldn't think of any that day. He tried to give examples of the way he's died to himself, but he admitted that it was kind of flimsy. I can think of people who have sacrificed so much, people who I've known my whole life, and some of you know them too, people who live on so little money so that they will never pay income tax since at least half of that goes to war. People who live on so little money so that they would just be gentler on the planet and the poor of the world, buying as little as possible so they aren't participating in the evils of slavery and exploitation and destruction of creation. I know people who have risked their freedom and reputation and comfort to proclaim peace and work for justice, and I don't hear these people calling themselves conservative. Maybe they don't even really call themselves progressive either. The people I'm thinking of who epitomize this more than anyone else, I realized, working on this sermon, they don't use any of those labels for themselves, and they intentionally go to a congregation where, like during COVID, there was the people with mask side and the people without mask side, because each of them thought they were absolutely the only ones doing it the right way. It's a very challenging congregation, and part of their ministry together is to stay together, and it's really hard. We've inherited enough toxic religiosity that says we are steeped in original sin, that we're hopelessly pathetic creatures, that we've got to spend our whole lives trying to be worthy of God or heaven. And I think that's why, at least for me as a progressive Christian, that's why I would be inclined to say what I'm called to do with my life is live as fully as I can into the person God created me to be. And that can be true, and it doesn't have to be the only truth. Because we are utterly beloved, and still we are inevitably broken. Not because we're immigrants or women or queer or transgender, that's not brokenness. But there are things in our lives that break us, or parts of us that are inevitably selfish, greedy, withholding, judgmental. This Western culture that we live in idolizes individualism, and we do need to be saved from capitalism, cruel, isolating culture. So if that looks like dying to ourselves to be reformed into God's people, I can resonate with that, but not because there was something wrong with us to start with, but because we, like Zacchaeus, are constantly pulled and lulled into self-justification. Let's imagine how he ended up being a tax collector in the first place. It's not something that kids would say, I look forward to being a tax collector when I grow up. It is such a hated part of their structure. But maybe he felt like he didn't have any other way to provide for himself or his family. Maybe nobody had taught him carpentry, and if his dad wasn't a fisherman, they didn't have a boat. So he could collect taxes. And he probably didn't cheat and steal at first. Here's how I think it happened. He was a tax collector, so his old friends didn't want to hang out with him anymore. So he starts hanging out with the people who will hang out with him, like maybe it's the Roman soldiers who protect him because they're all colluding with this empire. And then maybe he starts comparing himself to other Jewish colluders with Rome who are filthy rich and thinks, well, I don't have enough. So he starts taking more. And when I think back to all those faces in my mind of the people I would say are modern Zacchaeuses, I bet their origin story is pretty similar. If you compare yourself to somebody who always has more, you never think you have enough. It's one of many reasons we could follow Jesus' example and hang out with the poor. So there's probably been a nagging voice in Zacchaeus' head telling him he's corrupt, he's mean, And ignoring that voice makes him lonelier and more isolated. And it's in that desperation that he has this chance to see Jesus, and he's willing to sacrifice his whole life and be reformed. Are there messages that you're trying to ignore about your life? If we trust we are truly beloved, it's possible to risk a little more, maybe even risk it all. The math in this story is simple. Zacchaeus has to give up half of everything. And then anyone he's cheated, he has to pay back 4 times what he took. That would be hard, but that math is not hard. One of my best strategies for silencing the voice in my head is calling me to reform my life, is that I force complexity into the equation. I do a lot of bargaining. Like, I really shouldn't be doing this thing, but only in these circumstances, then I'm gonna be allowed to do it. I argue back and forth, and I might even want to say that my world is more complicated than Zacchaeus' world, but it's not really. It's not really, and ethical behavior is not actually more complicated. To long for Jesus enough, to trust Jesus enough, to submit to Jesus' teachings, that's where the sacred math comes in. I grew up with a fair degree of suspicion of Christians who say they worshiped Jesus, but they don't seem to be following him at all. And I think because of that, I just figured worshiping Jesus wasn't something I was interested in. So a lot of my journey of faith and then coming into ministry had to do with setting aside some of my intellectualizing, some of my need to not do it wrong, and so I just didn't want to do too much of it, just in case. So recently I was on the US-Mexico border with a group of pastors from Indiana, and we met a woman named Sister Norma, who turns out to be famous. Maybe some of you have heard of her. Truly, she was leaving that day after we met with her to go visit Pope Leo, who was not the first pope she's had an audience with. And it was after she met President Biden and asked him to come and see the refuge that she is part of in McAllen, Texas, that he really made it quite possible for a lot of people to come across the border. So Sister Norma is incredibly powerful. She's convinced a lot of business owners and rich people in McAllen, Texas, to give her money to house refugees and migrants who are moving through McAllen, Texas. Most of them don't even agree with her, but they cannot stand against when she says, just come and meet them, come and meet these families. She pours her whole self into this ministry. And this group of pastors was like worn out listening to her talk about what she does, and asked her how she finds the energy and inspiration to keep doing this, especially now when so many extra setbacks and cruelties have entered the immigration conversation and reality. And she said she spends an hour every morning in devotion to Christ. And as she was telling us this, she was gesturing out to this icon in the Catholic Charities Refuge there in McAllen. So I had the impression that that's how she spends her hour of devotion, is with an icon. It might not be that way. It humbles and convicts me that somebody truly busy who certainly gets more email than I do makes that hour available at the beginning of every day in devotion. There is a way that each of us, as progressives or conservatives or whatever we might call ourselves, whether we even say that we're Christian or we say we're a seeker or a way follower, there is a way that each of us can encounter Jesus with integrity and even with intimacy. And that can open our hearts to the life that is truly life, abundant and tough, faithful and joy-filled. Amen.